How is everybody doing? So, in this lecture, I'm going to introduce all of you to disaster relief and how the federal government deals with the issue of disaster management. So, before we get started, I just want to quickly share my screen with you and go over some of the basics of what this lecture is about. Okay, so as many of you know, disaster relief is important. Every year, this country has to deal with tornadoes, hurricanes, droughts, blizzards, and these problems can destroy property. They can destroy lives. They can destroy infrastructure, right? And so, people in the aftermath of these disasters need to pick up the pieces. And sometimes communities struggle to deal with these challenges on their own, and thus they need help from the outside, sometimes from the federal government. And so we're going to talk about how the federal government deals with disaster relief. And really, to understand this, first we have to go over some basic concepts. We have to understand what are disasters, what's disaster preparation, and finally, what does disaster relief mean? Secondly, we're also going to understand the history of federal disaster relief and why has it grown in the last 2 centuries? Why has it become more important within the federal government? Number three, we're going to understand some of the institutions that engage in disaster relief. We're really going to put a lot of focus on FEMA, but we'll talk about some others as well. And finally, we're going to understand some of the strengths and weaknesses of these institutions. And by doing this, you guys will be well prepared when you go to Washington, D.C. to understand a lot of things about the institutions that you're going to visit, right? And maybe this can inspire you to ask certain types of questions, and it'll help you as well understand some of the presentations that you're going to receive when you're there. So that is the main objective of this lecture. So first things first, we have to really discuss what exactly do we mean when we say disasters, right? Some disasters can be what we call natural disasters. That is, disasters not caused directly by human beings. Disasters caused by nature, right? So wildfires in California is a great example of this, right? You get drought, and from drought, then this could spark very massive fires. Storms such as hurricanes, tornadoes, blizzards, right? These things as well can cause disasters. If a storm is strong enough, it can destroy infrastructure and homes. It can cause flooding. So this is also another type of natural disaster. Earthquakes, for example, another type of disaster. And of course, droughts, right? So if suddenly there's a lack of water, this could cause a major crisis in a region. Now, not all disasters, though, are caused by nature, and in fact, FEMA deals with a lot of different types of disasters that are man-made disasters, things that are caused by us. And so this can involve a terrorist attack, like on 9/11. It can involve a major accident, such as what recently happened in that harbor in Baltimore, right, where that ship ran into a bridge. These type of major accidents can kill lots of people, destroy infrastructure. And, it could involve economic disasters such as the Great Depression and the resulting problems that's caused by that. All of these can destroy lives, destroy infrastructure, create all sorts of problems, right? And, of course, a great example of a disaster is the recent hurricane we all experienced, Hurricane Helena. Right. So, hurricanes, of course, are a natural disaster, very common to the southeastern part of the country. And in fact, it was the strongest hurricane, Hurricane Helena, to hit our region on record. Usually, hurricanes only really influence the coastal regions of the southeast. But this hurricane got much farther inland. It affected Appalachia and caused all sorts of damages. In fact, there was over $13 billion in damages caused by this hurricane, and there were over 200 deaths involved as a consequence of this. Over 500 roads had to be closed. In fact, on the day the hurricane took place, I was supposed to drive out to Clemson to go to the homecoming game on that day, but the bridges were shut down. So there were over 500 road closures, and over 4 million people lost power in the process. And of course, when all of these things happen and they happen suddenly and unexpectedly, help is needed for these people. So these disasters are something to be taken seriously. Now let's talk a little bit about trends with disasters. The number of disasters that have caused more than $1 billion in damage have actually grown exponentially over the last 4 decades. In fact, you can see in this trend here, the number of disasters have grown, and we can even see the types of disasters. Notice that the types of major disasters that have grown are severe storms and droughts. All of these are connected with problems such as climate change, right? So we are seeing an exponential growth in the number of massive climate disasters. And in fact, that storm that hit us very recently, one can argue that problems like climate change are causing this, right? Rapid changes in climate are bringing different types of storms to regions that aren't used to them. So this is a growing cause of concern for the U.S. government, these type of storms. Now, in terms of what parts of the United States disasters hit, certainly some areas of the country get hit more than others. So, for example, here in the Southeast, Texas, Louisiana, Florida, they get very heavily hit by disasters like hurricanes, right? So it's right on the Gulf Coast, right on the Gulf Coast, lots of warm weather, lots of hurricanes hit this region. Now, in the West here, in places like California, because of issues like drought, it gets hit by lots of wildfires. So these areas, as you can see on this map, they've had more disasters in terms of how much it's cost in terms of the billions of dollars, right? So in the Southeast, the West Coast have had the most problems, but other areas of the country experience them too. The northern parts of the country experience lots of problems with blizzards, for example. In the Midwest, it's known as Tornado Alley. Tornado Alley, they get tons of tornadoes. And even though Tennessee here doesn't get as much disasters as other parts of the country, such as Florida, we still do have disasters on a yearly basis, right? You can see that all of the country, right, that every state in the union has at least several disasters take place that require a federal response. So this is something that affects all of us, not just Florida, not just California. And of course, as witnessed by Hurricane Helena, it affects all of you. And so this is why disaster preparation is critical. So what is disaster preparation? Part of it means preparing for disasters and getting help to prepare for them, right? So you want to be prepared as a local community. This means having fire departments with the ability to suppress fires if you're in a region that's prone to wildfires. So having that local infrastructure in place is critical. Part of it is also the logistics and supply chain management, right? So having the roads and bridges, having the telephone lines, having access to GPS, having access to satellite communications. All of these things are critical. If we have a disaster, sometimes we have to evacuate people. We have to get them out of harm's way before the disaster comes. It's also critical as well to prepare because when a disaster hits, you need to send in the ambulances and the fire trucks. There needs to be a way for them to go from one place to another. And without the logistics there, it's impossible to do that. So preparing means building the necessary infrastructure. Part of it also means dealing with public health and healthcare, right? So having a system of hospitals in place and people who are trained to deal with emergencies and give medical aid when it's necessary. As well also means spreading knowledge to the public in terms of what to do to prepare for a disaster. Making sure you keep a sufficient amount of water in your home, a sufficient amount of non-perishable food so that you could survive a disaster, and letting the public know when a hurricane is about to come or some other disaster, having tornado warnings in place. All of these things are critical for disaster preparation. And, of course, a lot of this stuff as well is long-term vulnerability reduction. It's not just about, being prepared to deal with the disaster when it takes place, but reducing the chances of a disaster, right? So building the proper infrastructure. To give you a great example of this, New Orleans has a levee system. Part of the city sits under the water table. And if there's ever major flooding, New Orleans could be severely hurt, like what took place with Hurricane Katrina in 2005. So you got to build the proper infrastructure there. And so if you got proper levees and dams built, you can prevent flooding, for example. So a lot of disasters can be prevented when the money's invested. And of course, training personnel is critical. You need engineers to, for example, build the proper infrastructure. You need medical personnel to be trained to deal with these disasters. And of course, collecting scientific data. If you could warn people about a hurricane that's going to come, that is critical, right? So we need these type of institutions in place that could protect people from these disasters even before they take place. Now, of course, there's only so much you can do to prepare. Sometimes disasters happen and sometimes we're not even prepared for it. People need disaster relief if something bad happens, right? So they get caught in the middle of a hurricane and their home gets destroyed. They get injured because of a storm. Suddenly people need relief. And so disaster relief in part deals with individual relief. So if you lose your home, for example, you might need help with hotel expenses, right? Getting a temporary place to stay, or maybe just getting some money from the government to pay for the rent. You might have to rent out a new apartment, right? Or perhaps repairing the home itself once it's been severely damaged. So getting that individual relief to people that had their property damaged, this is a critical way to help people that have been affected by a storm. And of course, food and water, right? So oftentimes, grocery chains suddenly shut down. People lose access to food and water. So getting in that emergency relief to get people access to things that they need to survive is critical. And, of course, getting help with personal property. Sometimes people might lose their belongings, their clothes, basic access to the things they need to survive, right? So getting them access to things like clothing, blankets. This is something else that's important. And of course, transportation assistance. Some people lose their cars in the middle of a disaster, and thus getting them access to a car or being able to rent a car for a short time period. This might be critical to helping people out. And medical and dental assistance, right? If in the middle of a disaster you suddenly get injured, you break a bone, you need surgery, you might need help in terms of paying for those medical bills. And God forbid one of your family members die, you might need help with funeral assistance. So all of these things are encapsulated under individual relief, things people might need. And then finally, there is public assistance, giving assistance to local and state governments. During a disaster, things like roads might be covered with debris, right? Power lines might fall down, and it's dangerous to go out and travel. You want to get those roads cleared up as quickly as possible. So, getting the debris removed, taking emergency protective measures temporarily to make sure that people aren't traveling during these disasters while things are being cleaned up. All of these things are part of emergency work to help the public. And of course, repairing those roads after the disaster or those bridges, repairing water lines, utility lines, getting the electricity back up and running, getting the internet or cell phones back up and running. I'm sure a lot of you lost your power during that recent storm, right? So getting the infrastructure back up and running, a critical aspect of disaster relief. And, of course, during Hurricane Helena, there were all sorts of disaster relief that took place from non-governmental organizations, that is charity groups, to local government institutions, to state institutions, and finally the federal government. And the most important institution for giving relief during a disaster at the federal level is FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Association. And you can see here that during that hurricane, they provided approximately 1.2 billion in assistance, over 800 million in terms of individual assistance, and over 500 million in terms of public assistance. And they helped restore power to people's homes. They provided a lot of access to shelter. So over 11,000 people got access to transitional shelter assistance through hotels, and 1.4 thousand people got disaster survivor assistance. From people on the ground through FEMA. So over 1,000 FEMA employees came to help people. So that is a lot of assistance that was provided by this organization. So that's an example of disaster relief there. All right, so now the history of disaster relief. How has it transformed over time? Well, at the beginning of American history, the federal government was not involved very much in disaster relief. In fact, during the early period of American history, from 1788 all the way up till 1930, the federal government pretty much stayed out of the local affairs of states. We had this system called dual federalism in place, where there was really a separation of powers between the central government and the state governments, and the central government did not get involved much in local affairs. And during this time in history as well, the federal government was relatively weak, right? It had very few bureaucracies. It was mainly focused on foreign affairs, the military, and tax collection. It didn't get involved much in the internal affairs of states. And as a consequence of this, disaster relief was handled mainly by local and state governments. And there's a good reason for this. During this era in human history, especially before the late 1800s, America was a very agriculture-based nation. Most 90% of people lived in rural areas as farmers. The government itself, most problems were handled at the local level. You didn't have industrial technology or mass communications, so there were no telephones. There were no computers, right? And as a result, the government in Washington D.C. They would have had no way to quickly respond to a crisis that was happening in some other part of the country, right? So, for obvious reasons, disasters had to be handled at the local level. And unfortunately, because local communities often lack access to enough resources to deal with disasters, this meant that a lot more people used to die as a result of these disasters. So during this first period in American history, there was no federal disaster relief. So there were no federal emergency management agencies at all. The only thing the government would occasionally do at the federal level is sometimes Congress would, if a disaster happened somewhere, they might pass a bill that would send some money to that region to help them rebuild, right? But there was no systematic agency to deal with emergencies, and the federal government would have never been able to quickly respond to a disaster due to the slow nature of transport and communications. So, just once in a blue moon, the federal government would, send some money to some region long after a disaster took place. Just to give you an example, the first time the federal government did this was in 1802 in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, when a mass fire broke out and destroyed that city. The federal government, Congress, sent some money to help those people. But there was no organization like FEMA, to help put out that fire when it was taking place or to prevent it. The city simply burnt down. Lots of people died. Now, when did this begin to change? Well, it started to change in the 1930s when a lot of other things was changing about the American government. The period of 1930 to 1978, this is the period that's often known as a period of cooperative federalism. This is a period in which the power of the federal government began to grow greatly. The number of bureaucracies began to grow, and the federal government's influence on local and state governments began to increase greatly. This is during a period in the 1930s that we call the New Deal, when Franklin Delano Roosevelt was responding to the great crisis of the Great Depression, right? Trying to create new agencies to provide social welfare to citizens, provide them with food aid, housing, and other types of welfare programs to deal with the crisis. Well, this period as well involved a growth in bureaucracies involved with disaster relief. And one at a time, the government from 1930 all the way up till 1978 created new bureaucracies or added new programs to existing bureaucracies to deal with all sorts of issues with disaster prevention and disaster relief. So one at a time, we get over 100 bureaucracies were created during this era. And, a lot of the reason why this was possible was because by this time in history, America was an industrialized nation with, mass communication and a highway system. The federal government was better able to respond to crises. And on top of that, because of the crisis of the world wars, the Great Depression and the Cold War, suddenly this demand for the federal government to grow in power led to the adding of new agencies. And it wasn't just with disaster relief, it was with all sorts of other issues, from the military to issues such as urban housing development, education, all across the board. The federal government starts to grow in power. And I'll just give you an example of a few of these organizations that were created. So, for example, in 1932, and this is towards the end of Herbert Hoover's administration, this was during the Great Depression, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation was created. And basically, it was a bank that gave out emergency loans to businesses and individuals during a crisis. So if you just lost your home, here's an emergency loan. If you're a business and suddenly you're losing money because of the disaster, here's a loan to help deal with it. Later on in American history, we would start giving grant aid, that is just direct aid to people, money to people to help them through a crisis without a loan attached at all. That would be later in American history. Now, on top of that as well, the federal government had the Bureau of Public Roads, now called the Federal Highway Administration, in 1934. They gave them the ability to finance infrastructure rebuilding when a disaster took place. Now, the Bureau of Public Roads had already existed back in the early 1900s when the automobile came about and roads were beginning to be constructed. And in 1934, they decided to take this bureaucracy and have it engage in emergency management. So this is a case of a bureaucracy that already existed. Now it's engaging in some of its functions of disaster relief. The military as well also got involved. The United States Army Corps of Engineers, which had long existed within the United States military, going all the way back to the founding of the country, which was involved in engineering projects for the military, suddenly they became involved in disaster relief. The 1936 Flood Prevention Act had the United States Army Corps of Engineers involved in doing things like building infrastructure to prevent flooding, building levees, for example. And so this was very important. And this was all part of FDR's attempt as well to build up the infrastructure of the country. The Tennessee Valley Authority, for example, was built during this time period, right? The hydroelectric dam projects in this state were built. And, there's also all sorts of laws that were created to try to allow the federal government to deal with disasters in a more systematic manner. So, for example, in 1950, under this was back during the Truman administration, the Federal Civil Defense Administration was created with the goal of being able to evacuate civilians in the event of a natural or human-made disaster. And this was during the Cold War. There were these great fears of a nuclear war. Like, how would you evacuate civilians from an area if there was, a great disaster, such a nuclear weapon going off, right? So in 1950, this institution was created to evacuate people. And the Federal Disaster Relief Act of 1950 was also created. And essentially, what this Relief Act did is it allowed governors to contact the federal government, declare a state of emergency, and request aid be given to the states. So lots of different programs. And just one last example here, the United States Fire Administration was created in 1974 in order to try to deal with, big fires that break out, such as those that break out in California, and get states that deal with these problems prepared, right, to deal with fire management. So all sorts of programs were created. Now, and of course, the justification during this time period for the creation of these programs was to deal with the crises that was brought on by this period of this crisis of the 1930s, right? Right before the Great Depression, you had the Dust Bowl, in which, thousands of farmers lost their farms in the Midwest due to drought. You also had the Great Depression, which put millions of people out of work, out of jobs. And so the idea was the federal government needed to step in to help people dealing with this great disaster. And so James Olson, this is a book that was written on the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It's called Saving Capitalism. It's a book about helping people during disasters, whether they're man-made or they are a result of nature. Now, of course, there was a problem, though, that emerged with the creation of all these organizations. By the time we got to 1978, there were over 100 federal agencies involved in disaster relief. Can you imagine that, right? And so, why is this such a problem? Well, think about it. If you're a citizen and suddenly you lost your home, your car, your job, this means you would have to turn to many different types of agencies to get relief. You would have to make calls to different agencies. You would have to contact a lot of different types of people. Furthermore, if you're a state or a local government and you need to rebuild a lot of different types of infrastructure, well, suddenly you have to contact many different types of bureaucracies. This creates a lot of confusion. It creates a lot of inefficiency. And when you have 100 different federal agencies involved in disaster relief, it could lead to a lot of overlap. It could lead to a lot of bureaucratic infighting about who has responsibility over what. By the time we get to the 1970s, there was a realization that with this big growth of the American state, that a lot of inefficiency was emerging and that things needed to be simplified a bit. And so what ended up eventually happening is by 1978, the federal government decided that a bunch of these organizations needed to be combined together into a single institution. And this is FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, established in 1978. And what it essentially did is it combined dozens of organizations under a single umbrella. This would make it much easier for state and local governments as well as people to get the aid they needed when they needed it. And it would be also much easier to coordinate disaster relief by the federal government. So that was the idea behind this. Create coordination with a single organization. And it deals this organization with natural disasters as well as civil defense, right? And things that are caused by man-made disasters. Now, originally, it was placed under the Department of Housing and Urban Development, although it would change which bureaucracy it was under a little later in history. And so what eventually happened is this organization, it was created in order to deal with natural disasters. Now, over time, other functions have been added to FEMA to deal with new types of crises and disasters. For example, after 9/11, September 11th, when the Twin Towers in the Pentagon were struck with aircraft that were flown by members of Al-Qaeda, that were hijacked by members of Al-Qaeda, a decision was made to reorganize the federal government in order to deal with this threat of terrorism. And in 2002, the Department of Homeland Security was created. It consists of over 20 different bureaucracies that deal with national security. Things like border control and customs control. It deals with as well things like domestic disasters, not only dealing with terrorist attacks, but also dealing with the things that FEMA deals with, like natural disasters. So in 2002, FEMA was placed under the Department of Homeland Security, and that's where it currently exists today. And some of the focus as well, and this is very controversial, FEMA began to shift some of its focus to dealing with terrorist attacks. And part of the reason why this was controversial is this is not something FEMA was designed initially to deal with. And on top of that as well, some claim that terrorism is a bit of an overblown issue, that in comparison with natural disasters, far fewer people die from terrorist attacks. And thus a lot of resources were being wasted for this organization on this issue. In fact, there are some members of FEMA that want to pull the organization out of the Department of Homeland Security to this day. So this was a very controversial move when it took place. And in fact, some argue that this hurt a lot of the operations of FEMA in terms of natural disaster relief, taking away a lot of resources from it. In 2005, a hurricane hit New Orleans called Hurricane Katrina that caused a lot of damage and destruction, and FEMA was very slow to respond to the crisis. And some argued that the organization didn't have enough resources or personnel to meet that challenge. So in 2006, the Post-Katrina Emergency Management Reform Act was passed, and this essentially allows FEMA to contact the Department of Homeland Security and other organizations within it, asking it for emergency help and personnel if it doesn't have the resources to deal with the crisis. So FEMA, it can call on other bureaucracies for help when it needs to do things. So it could call on the military, it could call on the National Guard, it can call on all sorts of other institutions at the federal level if it does need the extra help to deal with the crisis. And so today, FEMA remains a pretty important organization within the Department of Homeland Security. It's got a budget of about $25 billion and over 20,000 workers that currently work with the institution. And so here is the just the organizational chart here for the Department of Homeland Security. You can see some of its functions. In 2002, U.S. Customs and Border Protection, U.S. Immigration Services, the Coast Guard, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, the Secret Service, and the TSA, the Airport Transportation Security Administration, were all placed under its umbrella along with FEMA. So the Federal Emergency Management Agency now falls under the control of Homeland Security. And so of course, it's a federal agency, so it has its offices in Washington, D.C. You guys will be visiting this institution for this trip and learning all about what this institution does. And along with the offices in Washington, D.C., FEMA as well also has regional offices. Since it has to coordinate disaster relief in many different parts of the country, it needs these regional offices. In fact, they have 10 regional offices in total, and our regional office is located in Atlanta, Georgia. So if there is a disaster, FEMA can respond relatively quickly to what is taking place. Now, FEMA, let's talk a little bit more about FEMA's responsibilities as an institution. It's got three major responsibilities, the first of which is what we call mitigation. Mitigation is all about preparing for a disaster. And so FEMA has institutions that are involved with scientifically analyzing things like storms, floods, and hurricanes. It also works with institutions that deal with the weather, right, in order to be able to collect data on natural disasters and better know how to prepare. Some regions of the country have different types of disasters that are more common. So, for example, if you're in a flood-prone region, you're more likely than if you're FEMA to promote flood insurance in those regions or to invest money in building levees in those regions. Whereas if you're in regions that are dealing with drought, obviously flood's not going to be a problem, but wildfires, such as in California, might be, right? So you might want to invest in fire management. So collecting data, incredibly critical, right? And so if you go to FEMA's organization, their website here, you can see the data they've collected, and you could also see as well the different services they provide on their main website. So feel free to check that out in your spare time. Now, these organizations as well, they also use that information that they collect to spread mass awareness. So if there's a hurricane, and it's ready to hit Florida, they warn the citizens of Florida, get out of the way of the hurricane, right? You need to evacuate. So this is a critical part of preparing for emergencies, as well as helping people, learn how to survive through a crisis. So telling them how to store water and food in their homes, making sure you store batteries, making sure you're prepared for a disaster. And of course, as you know, and some people lost their power for several days right here in Johnson City because of the hurricane, you've got to be prepared for disasters just in case they strike. They also as well do things like provide access to insurance for those who can't afford it, specifically flood insurance in some regions of the country. Now, unfortunately, in this area of the country with Appalachia, there wasn't this expectation that this big flood would hit. So FEMA, they've usually focused on areas like the southeast coastline, Florida, Texas, places that usually get hit hard by hurricanes when they promote flood insurance. But here in Appalachia, most people didn't have flood insurance, a big reason why this disaster really hit so many people hard. They also have as well something called the Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. They could provide aid to states and local governments to build the infrastructure they need to prevent disasters, right? So making sure that if New Orleans needs to improve its levees after Hurricane Katrina, they can get the money from the federal government through FEMA. So states can apply for grants to prevent disasters. And they also provide training for emergency personnel in their regional offices and in Washington. They have all sorts of training seminars, right, to help people at the local level deal with natural disasters. Now, remember, most disaster relief, it is still conducted by local and state governments, not the federal government. But one of the things FEMA can do is they can help train local personnel, whether that's police, EMTs, doctors, in terms of how to deal with these type of disasters. Now, what are some of the challenges here with FEMA and some of the criticism with this function? Well, one of the big criticisms is that too little money has been spent on mitigation and too much on responding to the crisis. In other words, we tend to put more money into solving the disaster after it's taken place and not beforehand. And I think this is a very human thing to do, right? We tend to underestimate the possibility that disasters are going to take place. We are prone to thinking that it's never going to happen to me. Why invest it? The public, as well, is usually sour on investing in long-term prevention of disaster. But when a disaster does hit and suddenly it's right in front of your face and we start panicking, suddenly we start to spend the money. So one of the criticisms of FEMA, as well as the federal government in general, not enough is spent on mitigation. This is a big problem. And just let me show you the data here. So for example, we spend 41% on public assistance grant programs. That is aid to local governments and state governments after the crisis has taken place. 26% to individual assistance after the crisis has taken place. Okay, but we only spend 5% of FEMA's budget on hazard mitigation. So only 5%. As you can see here, most of the rest, right, is spent on the salaries of the people who work at FEMA and so on and so forth. But we only spend 5% on hazard mitigation. So that's a tiny part of the budget. If we had spent more in New Orleans before 2005 to build a better levee system, that disaster would not have taken place. If we had spent more money in the Appalachian region to build bridges that could withstand floods, right, to really build the type of infrastructure that could prevent that type of flood damage that took place, we could have avoided that disaster to begin with. So, these are things to think about. We spend too little on hazard mitigation. And by the way, this is even we can even see this when we're looking at the employees and where they work. Only 9% of FEMA employees work on mitigation, whereas most of the rest work on responding to disasters after they have taken place. So we're not very good at planning ahead. This is a big problem we have. All right, now, second responsibility of FEMA, emergency response. Now, when it comes to emergency responses, believe it or not, FEMA doesn't jump in there right away. First, it's state and local governments that initially handle responses. And in fact, most storms that hit an area, they're not usually going to cause enough damage for the governor of a state to go up and call the president and say, hey, we need emergency relief. Most things can be handled at the state and local level, and they're handled there, right? But if a disaster gets too big where local and state level authorities are overwhelmed, and this happened with Hurricane Helene, it happened with Hurricane Katrina, then the governor, what they can do is they could call upon FEMA for help. And FEMA will only respond when local authorities are overwhelmed. And what needs to happen is the governor needs to request a federal disaster declaration. So the governor has to formally request it. And then the president must approve it before FEMA acts. So this is why FEMA, it usually takes time for them to get involved. The local and state authorities, right, they have to call for the help first. It has to happen first, right? And then what happens is after the governor issues the disaster declaration, the president then has to approve it. The president has to determine, can local authorities actually handle it on their own, or do they need the federal government's help? And the reason why this check is needed is, of course, if you're a state level government, you would love for the federal government to step in and pay for the disaster. That's less money out of state coffers. So the federal government, the rules in place are they cannot get directly involved unless they determine that local and state authorities are overwhelmed. So FEMA officials are sent to actually make that determination. So the president has to approve of it. Now, if FEMA If the president then approves it, FEMA then can act. And from that point on, FEMA can provide the following to individuals and local governments. They can provide people with temporary access to housing as well as access to food and water. Now, sometimes they will bring trailers in to house people, temporary housing. But what they usually do is they'll just give people money, for example, to go up in a hotel for a couple of nights, right? So usually they'll just provide temporary housing in that way. They'll also provide access to food and water. Now, once again, sometimes they could bring their own food and water, but what they often do is they cooperate with local and state agencies, as well as non-governmental organizations like Red Cross, to help them distribute the food, and they'll provide the financial resources to those organizations to get that food in. So they'll cooperate with a lot of different organizations to get this type of stuff done. Now, part of what they do, along with getting access to food and water and housing for people that have been affected by the disaster, they also have an urban search and rescue missions organization, right? They can send in people to pull people out of harm's way. So, for example, during Hurricane Katrina, a lot of people had their neighborhoods flooded. There were some people that were hanging out on their roofs waiting to be rescued. And so you had FEMA officials, as well as local and state agencies, local police officers and whatnot, trying to hunt people down and rescue them. They also, as well, will bring in power generators, right? So if the local power goes out, they could bring in mobile generators to get power. Obviously, you can't operate medical equipment, for example, without electricity. If the electricity gets knocked out, you might need emergency generators to help you. And they might as well also provide medical support or, once again, resources to local hospitals, right, in order to treat the sick and wounded. And so, as I said, FEMA, its staff is spread pretty thin throughout the country. While 20,000 people might seem like a lot, there are 50 states in the country. We have over 300 million Americans. What FEMA does more so than providing direct on the ground aid is they will often give financial institutions to non-governmental organizations, that is charity organizations, as well as state and local governments. And FEMA, they can also, if they, and sometimes what could happen with FEMA, and this is, by the way, another problem FEMA faces, is sometimes a disaster is so large that it overwhelms their budget and they run out of money. So what they sometimes have to do is they have to contact congressmen and say, hey, look, we need emergency funds. You got to pass this right away. And they could also call the Department of Homeland Security. They could call the secretary of the organization and ask for emergency help from other organizations. They could also call up the Pentagon, the military, to get assistance as well. Now, there's all sorts of problems and challenges that are created by this system, though. One of the challenges, as you notice, is that there are a lot of different institutions involved at the local, state, and federal government when it comes to emergency response. And this creates, as a result, a challenge of accountability. It's often difficult to know who to blame when there are problems with disaster relief. If there's a delay in getting relief to individuals or to public institutions, who do you blame? Do you blame the local government, the local mayor? Do you blame the governor of the state? Or do you blame FEMA and the federal government? So it's easy to point the finger at other organizations because there are so many different organizations involved. On top of that, this system involves a lot of coordination between organizations, and it could be sometimes slow to act, the federal government, right? And the governors of states as well can sometimes be slow to act. Some might be stubborn, more stubborn than others, to admit that they need help from the federal government. So sometimes it could take a while for the system to kick in. It took several days, for example, for FEMA to respond to Hurricane Katrina. So there's a challenge of accountability. And there's also a challenge of resources as well. So well, certainly a lot more is spent on emergency relief than is spent on emergency preparation. The fact is that we still don't spend enough on emergency relief either during these crises. Now, this chart you're looking at, what it's looking at is the FEMA's budget that's given to them at the beginning of year by Congress, and the amount of emergency relief, meaning add-ons to that budget they need after a crisis takes place. It's often the case every year that the budget given to FEMA is not enough to cover the amount of disasters that take place. And as a result, When a big enough disaster happens, FEMA will suddenly run out of resources. They've got to call Congress. And this can make it so that FEMA doesn't have enough resources on the ground, enough personnel. And this has really hurt the morale of many workers who work in FEMA because oftentimes they've struggled to respond to disasters. So oftentimes it has been a great struggle just getting the resources where it's needed. Okay, number three, the third responsibility of FEMA, recovery. So after the initial disaster takes place, you get people out of Dodge, you make sure you get them emergency medical treatment or food, water, and housing. There is then the issue of rebuilding, reconstruction, and FEMA is also involved in this. There are several things that FEMA does to reconstruct. Number one, they have what's called the Individual Assistance Grant Program. So this involves individual aid. So for example, they could provide aid to individuals to rebuild their homes. They can help repair their vehicle or buy a new vehicle for them. They can provide long-term medical assistance, right? Obviously, beyond the initial disaster, you might have some type of long-term medical condition created by the disaster and you need help. They could also provide assistance with things like funerals, for example. Now, in order to get access to this aid, though, individuals need to apply for it. And FEMA has to spread awareness in disaster areas to the individuals affected. Hey, go and contact your local FEMA office, fill out the paperwork, get the aid you need. And so they have to spread awareness. And it's critical that people are aware that FEMA exists, that they know what it does, and that it can provide them help, right? So that is something that's critical for this system to work here. Now, of course, along with that, they can also provide aid to local and state governments. This is called the Public Assistance Grant Program. This involves aid for local and state governments to rebuild infrastructure, such as roads, bridges, power lines. And right now, a lot of that aid is being built to rebuild those bridges on 26, right? That highway that goes towards Asheville. So lots of that aid is critical. Now, it's not just FEMA, though. So, and I just want to mention this on a short note. There are other agencies that are involved in long-term recovery to help people after a disaster. And there's a ton of them that are involved. So, for example, the U.S. Small Business Administration provides business loans and aid to businesses that were affected by disaster, usually very low interest loans. The U.S. Department of Labor can provide assistance to people that became unemployed as a result of a disaster or temporarily out of work. The Internal Revenue Service, so they can provide tax relief to people. You got hit by a natural disaster, you can get big tax breaks. So this is something else to consider. If you were hit by the recent hurricane that came through, you could actually get a nice tax break as a consequence of that. Once again, this requires access to knowledge and information, right? So if you're aware of this, you can get help. Then the Agricultural Food and Drug Administration can provide food aid through food stamps, and the FDA as well, the Food and Drug Administration, also is involved in various things that are involved with helping people out in terms of food. We're actually going to be visiting the FDA along with visiting FEMA, and we're also going to visit the Pentagon as well and a couple of other sites on this trip. Now, what are the challenges with recovery? Well, there are several major challenges here that deal with fraud, waste, and inefficiency. Now, there's several reasons why there are lots of challenges with disaster recovery when it comes to fraud and waste and inefficiency. So part of the problem with fraud here is that because disasters are very messy things, you will have some individuals that will try to take advantage of the situation. So for example, their car might have not been destroyed by the hurricane, but it might have been damaged by an accident that had nothing to do with the hurricane, but they might try to use the hurricane to their advantage to get FEMA relief. Or, people might try to abuse the system to get, access to money when they don't deserve it. Maybe a relative died, not because of a hurricane, but a separate reason, but they lie to FEMA, right? And they get the money to pay for the funeral. This happens, unfortunately, more often than you would like to think. So there's some fraud in the system, and unfortunately, FEMA needs more employees to be able to vet the people who are requesting money. Of course, we want people who suffer from disasters to get money as quickly as possible, but you also don't want people ripping the system off either. And this is a constant problem with an organization like FEMA. Disasters create a lot of chaos, and chaos creates room for corruption and inefficiency. Now, there's also a problem at the other end of the spectrum. Not only do you have this problem of people not needing the aid but still getting it because of fraud, you also have the problem of people who do actually need the aid, but they don't get it because they're either not aware of what FEMA does or they've heard misinformation about FEMA, and therefore they're not willing to fill out the paperwork to get the money. So being aware of what FEMA does is critical if you want to get access. Access to information is critical. And unfortunately, believe it or not, it's usually people who are more educated and wealthy that will end up applying for relief aid because they have more political awareness, right? They know what FEMA is, and they're able to get that aid. And it's often people that have less awareness, they struggle to get access to info. Now, what FEMA tries to do is they try to spread awareness. You can see here this flyer here as an example. They will go around these disaster areas spreading awareness. They will give radio addresses, commercials to try to make people know, hey, this organization exists. Now, during the last hurricane, the one that hit here in Appalachia, a kind of new problem was introduced for FEMA, and this problem of conspiracy theories over social media. And so there is a widespread belief among some Americans that as an institution, FEMA was deliberately not helping Trump supporters. Now, I know there were a couple of true stories of individual FEMA employees. I know there was a story of one FEMA employee in Florida that was accused of deliberately not informing Trump supporters of, that aid was available. But that was a single employee, right? That, was caught doing that, and that person was immediately fired. But when things like that happen and they spread over social media, this could then lead to conspiracy theories. And suddenly you get a lot of people deliberately not contacting FEMA to get access to aid. It is so critical for the government to function in a democracy. Trust is needed in institutions. And when that trust fails, this could be an incredible problem. Now, to be fair to a lot of people who don't trust FEMA, there's also some good reasons why there's some anger at FEMA. In some past disasters like Katrina, there's often been problems with slow response rates. There's often been problems getting access to aid where it's needed. And so there's a lot of anger that's actually deserved at this institution as well. And that helps to fuel, in turn, some of the false conspiracies that are spreading out there. So this is a challenge that FEMA is dealing with. Now, last but not least, I just kind of want to bring this up quickly because it's important. Local, state, and federal institutions are not the only agencies that can help people. Private citizens, even individuals like yourself, can get involved when disasters take place. Non-governmental organizations, NGOs, are heavily involved. They accept volunteers, they accept donations. Disaster management, it's not only done by the government, but you as individuals can help out your community in so many different ways. And so there's all sorts of NGOs involved in disaster relief. AmeriCares is one example. We might be visiting AmeriCares on this trip. The Red Cross is another example. In fact, they're an international institution. They work in many different parts of the globe. Salvation Army, this is another international institution that deals with emergency relief. And there are many more. And in fact, at the local level, you have small organizations, even soup kitchens, right? When we visit Washington, D.C., you're going to be volunteering for a soup kitchen. So there are so many different organizations out there that can provide help and assistance to people, and I think it's incredibly important for us to survive and work through these disasters. We have to work together as a nation, whether we're Republicans or Democrats. We're all in the same boat here. And so it's so important that we help each other out when we need it. Okay, so that does it for my lecture. Of course, I'll be traveling with you guys. Feel free to ask myself questions. And of course, the people we're going to be visiting are going to have even more knowledge on myself. When you work in these fields and you spend years working in these institutions, they're going to be giving you guys a lot of info. I guarantee you I'm going to be learning a lot on this trip as well. So I'm looking really forward to this experience. Okay, so I'll talk to you guys later. And I'm going to send this via email so that all of you have access to it.